Just a little bit of data from what I mentioned earlier regarding the current violence and disorder being the worst since the 1992 Los Angeles riots. Um, the Week magazine was reporting the Times newspaper in saying it's the worst racial violence in America since the 60s. Actually, per the statistics, the 1992 Los Angeles riots saw 63 dead and some 12,000 arrests. I mean, that was extreme. It wasn't just the worst of modern times, but it was one of the worst ever. In fact, I think you'd have to go back to the Red Summer of 1919 to see violence on the scale of 1992. That even surpasses some of the violence of the 1960s. However, the current violence is the most widespread since the 1960s, since the King assassination riots of 1968. There was also a serious racial riot in Miami in 1980 when 18 were killed. So far, at least 8 have been killed in the current unrest. Anyway, the source of all this anger, or one of the major trigger effects of this was, of course, the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis by a state officer. Now, there's another kind of police brutality that takes place in the United States, and it isn't an isolated case. I've literally just heard about this. And the case I'm going to reference here actually happened in 2014, but the individual involved still hasn't had justice in terms of holding the officers to account. Now, what's significant about this case, and I'll put a link to it, is the individual involved is white, young white man, and the officers involved were white. Now, it could be that could be the reason why it hasn't got as much attention. I've seen a few videos about it because I've looked a bit further into it. But anyway, this is what happened, and it really raises serious questions about the American system in terms of legal grey areas and in terms of, well, corruption. No other word for it. If not de facto corruption, certainly moral corruption. So basically, this young guy, James King, he was only 21 at the time. He was walking through Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he suddenly found himself confronted by two men who demanded to know who he was. They then accosted him, took his wallet. He assumed he was being mugged. They wanted to know what his name was, and he ran away. They tackled him, and they beat him badly. They choked him, and apparently passers-by saw this and actually feared for his life to the point where they called the emergency services. Um, and it's only afterwards, when James was in the hospital, did he realize, or rather, when other local law enforcement arrived, did he realize actually this was law enforcement. Now, this is what's significant about this case. This wasn't just any law enforcement. This was actually federal officers. I'll just read out from the article. They were actually one federal officer and one local officer. This was Grand Rapids Police Detective Todd Allen and FBI Special Agent Douglas Brownback. They were members of the Joint Task Force, and they were in plain clothes searching for one Aaron Davison, who was accused of felony home invasion and had a warrant out for his arrest. Now, the man they were looking for was a 20-something white male between 5'10" and 6'3", with glasses and a thin build, which is a pretty broad description. I mean, there's a big difference between 5'10" and 6'3". But if you looked at the photograph that they had of the man, of this guy, Aaron Davison, he looks so different from the man they attacked. I mean, he looks so different from James King. James King doesn't wear glasses. Certainly wasn't wearing glasses when this attack happened. He's got a different hair color. He doesn't look anything like the guy they were looking for. But what is particularly shocking about this, let's say it was just a case of mistaking identity. Okay, mistakes happen. What's particularly repugnant about this case is these corrupt cops, these thugs, then demanded immunity. because apparently, and his lawyers have pointed this out, that when it comes to federal police, they can actually hide behind a sort of legal immunity, which means that the sort of constitutional rights that are used to protect citizens in other cases become murky when you get this sort of joint situation. So, for example, a federal officer accused of abusing his position can claim they were acting under state guidelines. A state officer, a local officer, who's in a joint task force with a federal officer can say they were acting under federal jurisdiction and hence is outside the domain in which the citizen could claim, uh, could, could push for a prosecution. So basically, American citizens who are caught up in this sort of situation, mistaken identity, they don't have the law on their side. They're not given legal support. And what's shocking about this case is this young guy was sent to prison. He only got out because his father got a $50,000 bond. Now, it makes you wonder. Obviously, this young man was from a relatively well off background. It makes you wonder what would be the situation for poor Americans. And it's frightening to think that right now, this is a country that incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. Over 2 million Americans are behind bars. Some of them deserve to be there without question, but it does make you wonder how many of them might actually be innocent. And in situations like this, and they haven't been able to defend themselves because of this very corrupt situation, whereby basically federal officers are not accountable. I'll put a link to the video into the news report. It's shocking. And quite frankly, I can't leave this video without saying this. I've always been very vocal when it comes to countries like China, and one of the reasons I'm very vocal about communist states is because there is no free media to scrutinize corruption. Now, at least in the United States, there is a free media, and the media will cover things like this. So this was reported. I believe. Let me just get the. I think it was a local news station. Let me just check this out. Yeah, it's a local news station. So this shows the important Fox 17 WXMI. Um, that's why free media is so very, very important because without it, these cases wouldn't be reported. But that doesn't mean that the situation in America is. I mean, I believe that the current unrest is not good for public relations. It's really not, because China and Russia will be looking at what's happening, and it doesn't exonerate all the things they've done. Far from it. I certainly wouldn't be taken in by their propaganda. But it goes without saying they're going to use it. They're going to be plastering this. I mean, the Chinese state is going to be plastering this all over Weibo and saying, "Oh, look, this is America. Look at the human rights abuses in America." And here's the thing. I'm not anti-American. I think the United States is a great country. Um, but frankly, the United States of America cannot boast about its human rights record. It just can't. So long as situations like this go on. And that's not to say that you won't get police abuse in pretty much every country. I mean, my country's not free from it. But this situation where federal officers can basically get immunity, whereby it's like a sort of bribery. Well, his lawyers actually advised him very, very few people win cases where they try to sue the federal government. That's a disgrace. It's extremely corrupt. And it makes you wonder, well, I mean, basically, he was there for choice. Either plead guilty to something you didn't do and get at least 10 years in prison as an innocent man, or take a plea deal and you'll you could be found innocent, or you won't be able to prosecute the officers involved. Now, the jury found this young man not guilty, and he was overcome by emotion, and the jury were convinced that he was innocent because they could see the footage, they could see the evidence. But it did mean that it would make it a lot harder for him to get. So it's kind of like, okay, well, at least I'm not going to jail, but where's the justice for him? Witnesses said they felt he could have died. Um, and bear in mind, this was a white guy, quite a well-off white guy, white cops. So it does make you wonder, what would be the situation with someone who's from a poorer background? The US really, really needs to get stuff like this together because it's embarrassing in terms of the land of the free. Well, look, I'm not anti-American, but when it comes to human rights, America is very, very far from number one. Very far. I'm not going to name any country that I believe is number one, but definitely not the United States. I also have a problem with the extensive use of solitary confinement. I'm conservative on crime. I believe dangerous, violent criminals should go to jail. But that's another thing. The extensive use of solitary confinement over there, as well as situations like this, is pure corruption. And I don't know how federal officers can use immunity from violating constitutional rights that they're supposed to uphold, that they sign up to uphold. They should have recognized that they got this wrong. They should have just come clean and apologized to the victim and given him a financial settlement instead of actually clambering to get immunity and adding insult to injury by charging him with, even though it was very obvious that he was innocent. It's just staggering. So I'll put a link to the report. And yeah, with the greatest respect to American viewers, and I'm not saying, many Americans are well aware of this, but there is frankly also a chauvinistic aspect to some Americans who, and they like to boast about how great America is. Well, not in these sort of situations, it's not.